The stars looked different from this far out, and Captain Daniel Harper knew that his crew was making history with every passing day. The exploration vessel Horizon had traveled farther than any human ship before, and the 200 people aboard were excited about what they might find in the darkness between distant suns. Harper stood on the bridge, watching the screens that showed endless space around them, and he felt proud of how far humanity had come in just 200 years since leaving. Earth Chief Engineer Lisa Monroe was working at her station when the sensors picked up something massive near a gas giant in the Kepler 442 system. She called Harper over and pointed at the readings that showed a structure so large it made their ship look like a toy. The captain ordered the crew to yellow alert and told Communications Officer Paul Zhang to try making contact with whatever had built something so huge. Zhang worked for hours sending mathematical sequences and basic greetings in every format. They knew until finally something responded. The message came back in patterns that Zhang could understand, and it seemed friendly. The beings who built the station called themselves the Velthran, and they welcomed humans to visit their home. Harper felt his heart racing, because this was the moment Earth had been waiting for since the day humans first looked up at the night sky. He gathered his senior officers and told them to prepare for first contact, and everyone moved with purpose, knowing they were about to meet an alien civilization. When the Horizon docked with the Velthran station, Harper led a team of 12 people through the airlock. The station inside was beautiful, with walls that seemed to glow softly, and corridors wide enough for 20 people to walk side by side. Then they saw the Velthran themselves, and Harper had to remind himself to breathe. The aliens were tall and thin, with skin that looked like crystal, and when light hit them, they shimmered with colors that had no names. Their leader came forward and spoke through a device that translated his words into English, and he said his name was Keeper Naleth. The meeting went better than anyone had hoped. Keeper Naleth showed them technology that could help humans travel even faster through space, and he gave them maps to systems filled with resources Earth needed. He talked about peace and cooperation between their species, and Harper found himself believing every word. The diplomatic team spent 3 days on the station learning about Velthran culture and history, and when they finally returned to the Horizon, everyone was celebrating. Harper sent messages back to Earth telling them that humanity had found friends among the stars. Dr. Karen Wells was the ship's xenobiologist, and she had been running tests on samples the Velthran had given them. Something about the readings bothered her, but she could not figure out what it was at first. Then, during a medical scan of one of the Velthran who visited the Horizon, she saw something strange. The alien's biological signature flickered like a bad video signal, and for just a moment it looked like something else was underneath. Wells ran the scan 3 more times, and each time she saw the same flicker. She took her findings to Captain Harper, but he was busy writing reports for Earth, and he told her it was probably just a quirk of alien biology that they did not understand yet. 3 weeks passed after the Horizon left the Velthran station, and everything seemed normal. The crew went about their duties, and Harper was already planning the next diplomatic mission. Then people started having nightmares. At first it was just a few crew members who reported bad dreams, but within days more than half the ship was waking up screaming. Security Chief Greg Palmer noticed something else that worried him even more. He kept finding crew members in parts of the ship they had no reason to be in, and when he asked them what they were doing, they looked confused and said they did not remember going there. Navigator Amy Foster was found dead in her quarters on a Tuesday morning. Medical Officer Henry Brooks examined her body and found nothing wrong with her. No poison, no disease, no injury. She looked like she had just gone to sleep, except her eyes were open and frozen in an expression of pure terror. Brooks could not explain what had killed her, and that scared him more than anything. Harper ordered a full investigation, but before Palmer could start asking questions, 2 more crew members died the same way. Dr. Wells locked herself in her laboratory and worked without sleeping for 2 days straight. She had taken samples from the ventilation system, and what she found made her blood run cold. There were microscopic organisms in the air that matched nothing in any database, human or alien. Under her strongest microscope, she could see them moving with purpose, like they were looking for something. When she tested them on tissue samples, they burrowed into the cells and started changing the neural pathways. These things were alive, and they were inside everyone on the ship. She ran from the lab to find Captain Harper and tell him they needed to quarantine the entire crew immediately. Wells found him standing in the observation deck staring out at the stars. She called his name 3 times before he turned around, and when he did, she saw that his eyes were empty. Harper looked at her, but it was not really him looking back. Something else was behind those eyes, and it was studying her like a scientist studies a bug. Wells backed away slowly and then ran as fast as she could toward the engineering section. Lisa Monroe was checking power systems when Wells burst through the door looking terrified and out of breath. The doctor tried to explain what she had found, but the words came out jumbled and frantic. Monroe sat her down and made her start from the beginning. As Wells talked about the parasites and the infected crew and the captain who was not himself anymore, Monroe felt her stomach turn. She had cybernetic implants in her brain from an accident when she was young. And suddenly she understood why she had not been having the nightmares like everyone else. The implants were protecting her. Monroe pulled up the security feeds, and what she saw confirmed their worst fears. Crew members were moving through the ship in groups working together on something, but their movements were too coordinated. They walked in perfect synchronization like puppets on strings, and their faces showed no emotion at all. Monroe counted the people on the screens and realized that more than 80 crew members were infected. She made a decision that went against every regulation in the book. She activated the emergency lockdown on the engineering section, sealing them inside with blast doors that could survive a direct hit from a missile. Security Officer Rita Chen had been doing her rounds when the doors slammed shut. She ran to engineering and pounded on the door until Monroe let her in. Behind Chen came Dr. Wells and a young technician named Kevin White, who looked scared out of his mind. Monroe told them what was happening, and Chen immediately understood that they were now at war with their own crew. The 4 of them watched the security monitors as the infected people worked together to change the ship's course. Monroe checked the navigation and saw that the horizon was heading straight back to Earth. Kevin White was good with computers, and he managed to access some encrypted files that Captain Harper had locked away. What he found made everyone in the room go silent. The Velthrin were not really a separate species at all. They were hosts for an ancient parasitic intelligence that traveled from star to star, consuming entire civilizations. The beautiful crystalline beings they had met were just the latest victims of something that had been alive for thousands of years. The parasites spread by contact, and once they had enough hosts, they could control them all like a single organism, with millions of bodies. Monroe looked at the others and knew what they had to do. If the horizon reached Earth, the parasites would spread to billions of people within weeks. The human race would be consumed just like dozens of other species before them. She pulled up the ship's self-destruct protocols and started entering the override codes. Chen asked if there was any other way, and Monroe shook her head. They had to destroy the ship and everyone on it, including their friends and the captain. It was the only way to save Earth and humanity. Dr. Wells agreed and said she would buy them time to reach the escape pods. She had found a frequency that could slow down the parasites, and she could broadcast it through the ship's communication system. The blast doors started to buckle as the infected crew tried to break through. Monroe finished entering the codes, and the computer announced that the ship would self-destruct in 20 minutes. She told everyone to run for the escape pods while Wells stayed behind at her console. The doctor smiled at them and said this was what she had trained her whole life to do. She was going to save humanity even if it cost her everything. Monroe grabbed Chen and White, and they ran through the maintenance tunnels while behind them, Wells pressed the button that flooded the ship with the frequency she had discovered. The infected crew members stopped moving for just a moment, and that moment was enough. The escape pod launched with 6 survivors inside, just as the horizon exploded in a flash of light that could be seen for millions of miles. Monroe watched through the small window as pieces of the ship scattered into the void, and she cried for the first time since she was a child. They had won this battle, but the war was just beginning. The Velthrin were out there, and now they knew that humans were not as easy to infect as they had thought. Monroe closed her eyes and hoped that her warning message had. The escape pod drifted through empty space for 6 days, and the survivors barely had enough food and water to stay alive. Lisa Monroe spent most of her time trying to keep the life support systems running, while Rita Chen rationed what little supplies they had. Kevin White monitored the emergency beacon, hoping that someone would find them before the oxygen ran out. On the 6th day, a ship appeared on their sensors, and Monroe felt relief wash over her when she saw it was the Earth Patrol vessel Guardian. They were going to make it home, and they were going to warn everyone about what was coming. Captain of the Guardian was a woman named Linda Shaw, who listened to their story with a face that grew more concerned with every word. She immediately sent encrypted messages to Earth Command, telling them about the Veltrin parasites and the threat they posed to humanity. Shaw gave the survivors food and medical care and told them they would reach Earth in 4 days. Monroe asked if her warning transmission had gotten through, and Shaw nodded slowly. Earth had received the message, but what happened next was complicated, and Monroe was not going to like it. President Victoria Cross had been in office for 3 years, and she had built her career on the promise of finding alien allies for humanity. When the first reports came from the horizon about successful contact with the Veltrin, she had celebrated on live television in front of billions of people. She announced a new age of cooperation between species and ordered the construction of 5 new diplomatic vessels. The news of the horizon's destruction came as a shock, but what came next was even worse. The Veltrin sent their own delegation to Earth, claiming that the Horizon crew had been infected by a rogue element that the Veltrin themselves were fighting against the United Earth Coalition. Council was divided right down the middle. Half the members believed Monroe and the other survivors, while the other half thought it was all a tragic misunderstanding. The Veltrin delegation was very convincing, and they brought gifts of technology that would solve Earth's energy problems forever. They showed holographic records of their own people fighting against the parasites, and they said they wanted to help humanity avoid the same fate. Admiral Frank Pierce of the Space Defense Initiative sat in the council chambers and watched the vote happen. By a margin of just 3 votes, the council agreed to allow Veltrin representatives onto Earth for formal diplomatic ceremonies. Monroe testified before the council, and she told them everything she had seen. She described how the parasites changed people and how they worked together like a hive mind. She showed them Dr. Wells' research and played the security footage from the horizon that Kevin White had managed to save. But the council members who supported the Veltrin said the footage could have been faked, and that Monroe was traumatized by what happened. They said she was seeing threats where none existed. Monroe wanted to scream at them that they were making a mistake that would cost billions of lives, but Admiral Pierce put a hand on her shoulder and told her to save her energy. After the vote, Pierce took Monroe, Chen, and White to a secure facility hidden under the ice in Antarctica. He told them that he believed every word they said, and he was not going to sit back and watch humanity be consumed by parasites. Pierce had been building a secret resistance network for years, preparing for threats that most people did not want to believe in. He had scientists and soldiers and engineers who were loyal to him, and who understood that sometimes you had to break the rules to save the world. Monroe looked around the facility and saw hundreds of people working on weapons and equipment. Pierce told her they had been developing something based on Wells's frequency research, and he wanted her help to make it better. The first Veltrin delegation landed in Geneva 3 weeks after the council vote, and the city, through a massive celebration, thousands of people gathered in the streets to see the aliens, and news cameras from every country broadcast the event live. The Veltrin walked among the crowds, shaking hands and posing for pictures. They looked peaceful and friendly, and most people thought Monroe had been wrong about them. But within 12 hours, reports started coming in that people in Geneva were acting strange. They complained of nightmares and memory gaps. Some of them were found wandering the streets with blank expressions on their faces. Kevin White was monitoring social media and news feeds from Pierce's facility, and he saw the pattern emerging. People who had been near the Veltrin were getting sick, and the sickness was spreading fast. He tracked the infected individuals using security camera footage and cell phone data. What he found made his blood run cold. The infected people were going to water treatment plants and food distribution centers. They were touching everything they could and spreading the parasites to as many people as possible. Within 2 weeks, the infection had reached every major city on Earth. Lisa Monroe worked with Pierce's scientists to build devices that could broadcast the anti-parasite frequency. They were crude and only worked at short range, but they were better than nothing. The first field test happened in Rome, where a group of infected people were trying to take over a government building. Pierce's soldiers hit them with the frequency, and the infected people dropped to the ground unconscious. When they woke up hours later, they had no memory of what they had done, but the parasites in their brains were dormant. It was not a cure, but it was a weapon they could use. The infection spread faster than anyone had predicted. Government leaders started acting strange and making decisions that helped the Veltrin gain more power. Military bases were ordered to stand down, and police forces were told not to interfere with infected individuals. Rita Chen led teams of resistance fighters in raids to secure key infrastructure. They had to fight their way through infected soldiers and civilians, and every battle was heartbreaking, because they were fighting their own people. Chen had trained these soldiers and worked with them for years, but now she had to knock them unconscious or tie them up to stop them from spreading the parasites further. One mission took Chen to a communications hub in Berlin, where infected technicians were trying to shut down the internet. She led a squad of 12 resistance fighters through the building, fighting room by room. In the main server room, she found her old friend and mentor, Captain Daniel Harper. He was standing over a console entering commands that would give the Veltran control over every satellite in orbit. Chen called his name and Harper turned to face her. His eyes were empty, and when he spoke, it was not his voice anymore. The parasite inside him said that resistance was useless, and that humanity would be better off joining the collective. Chen raised her weapon and told Harper she was sorry. She fired the frequency device and Harper collapsed. Her team secured the building, but Chen stood over Harper's unconscious body and cried because she knew the man she respected was gone forever. Monroe made a breakthrough in the 4th week of the invasion. By studying the patterns of parasite communication, she realized they were all connected to something. The infected people were like computers in a network, and somewhere there had to be a central server controlling them all. She told Pierce that if they could find and destroy that central nexus, the entire parasite network would collapse. Kevin White started analyzing every signal the Veltran sent and received, looking for the source. He worked for days without sleep, drinking coffee until his hands shook, but finally he found it. The signals were coming from deep space beyond Neptune's orbit. Pierce called a meeting with his top people and laid out the situation. They had found the parasite nexus, but it was heavily defended, and getting to it would require a fleet of ships they did not have. The Resistance had a few stolen military vessels, but nothing that could survive a major battle. Monroe said they needed to get authorization from Earth Command to launch a strike, but Pierce shook his head. Earth Command was compromised and most of the admirals were infected. If they asked for permission, the parasites would know they had found the nexus and would move it somewhere else. The answer came from an unexpected source. Kevin White had been monitoring communications from infected individuals, and he noticed something strange. Some of the infected people were fighting back from inside. Their messages were garbled and confused, but they were trying to send information to the Resistance. One message came through clearly, and it was from engineer Alan Torres, who had been on the horizon. Torres had been infected during the first contact, but part of his consciousness was still alive inside the collective. He sent the exact coordinates of the nexus and detailed information about its defenses. He said that other infected humans were helping him fight from within, and that they could cause disruptions during an attack. Pierce made the decision that would change everything. He was going to lead a strike force to the nexus using every ship the Resistance could gather. It was a suicide mission, and everyone knew it. The ships were outdated, and the crews were mostly volunteers who had nothing left to lose. Many of them were in the early stages of infection and wanted to strike back before the parasites took full control. Monroe wanted to go with them, but Pierce ordered her to stay on Earth. He said she needed to be ready to broadcast the anti-parasite frequency worldwide when the nexus was destroyed. It was the only way to save the people who were already infected. Admiral Frank Pierce watched the screens as his fleet approached the coordinates that Alan Torres had sent from inside the parasite collective. The journey had taken 6 days, and every hour they got closer, Pierce could feel the weight of what they were about to do. The ships around him were old patrol vessels and cargo haulers that had been fitted with whatever weapons the Resistance could find. They were not meant for combat, but they were all humanity had left. In the crew quarters below him, 3,000. People prepared for battle, knowing most of them would not see home again. The nexus appeared on their sensors when they were still 2 million miles away, and even from that distance it was terrifying. The structure was massive, beyond anything humans had built. A living ship the size of a small moon that pulsed with sickly green light. Pierce could see organic tendrils extending from its surface that waved slowly in the vacuum, like underwater plants in a current. His science officer said the readings were off the scale and that the energy coming from the nexus could power Earth for 1,000 years. Pierce did not care about the energy. He cared about destroying the thing before it consumed his species. The Veltran knew they were coming. As the Resistance fleet closed the distance, weapons emerged from the nexus surface. They were not like human weapons made of metal and explosives. These were organic cannons that fired living projectiles that could think and adapt. The first volley hit 3 of Pierce's ships, and the projectiles burrowed through the hulls like acid eating through paper. The ships exploded from the inside and 200 people died in seconds. Pierce ordered the fleet to spread out and return fire, but their weapons barely scratched the Nexus surface. Back on Earth, Lisa Monroe was in the Antarctic facility preparing the global broadcast system. Every satellite and communications tower on the planet had been modified to broadcast the anti-parasite frequency at the same time. The technical challenges were enormous because many of the key systems were controlled by infected personnel who would try to stop them. Monroe had teams standing by at critical locations ready to activate the broadcast manually if needed. She watched the countdown clock on her screen and knew that Pierce and his fleet were fighting for their lives in the darkness beyond Neptune. Rita Chen was leading one of those teams at a satellite control station in Colorado. She had 20 resistance fighters with her holding off infected security forces who were trying to retake the facility. The fighting was close and brutal, with gunfire echoing through metal corridors. Chen's team was outnumbered 3-1, but they had better training and they were fighting for something bigger than themselves. She shot infected soldiers in the legs, trying not to kill them, because somewhere inside those bodies were people who deserved to be saved. Her weapon clicked empty and she grabbed a metal pipe from the wall, using it to knock down 2 more attackers before her team could reload. Kevin White was in the main control room coordinating all the resistance teams around the world. His screen showed dozens of battles happening simultaneously as infected forces tried to shut down the broadcast system before it could activate. White was exhausted and terrified, but he kept working because Dr. Wells had died to give them this chance. He thought about the doctor standing alone on the horizon, broadcasting the frequency that saved their lives. Now he was going to make sure her sacrifice meant something. A message came through from Pierce's fleet, and White's heart sank when he read it. They were losing badly, and Pierce was preparing for a final, desperate move. The resistance fleet was down to 15 ships, and the Velthran weapons were tearing them apart faster than Pierce could react. His flagship had taken heavy damage, and half the crew was dead or dying. The medical bay was overflowing with wounded, and the ship's doctor was doing surgery in the corridors because there was no more room. Pierce stood on the bridge with blood running down his face from a cut above his eye. His tactical officer told him they could not win this fight with conventional attacks. The Nexus was too strong and their weapons were too weak. They needed to get close enough to use the ship's reactor as a bomb. Inside the Nexus, the parasite intelligence was confident it would win. It had consumed hundreds of species over thousands of years, and humans were no different. Their resistance was impressive but ultimately futile. The collective consciousness spread across billions of infected hosts felt satisfaction as it directed the defense of its Nexus. But something was wrong. Some of the infected humans were fighting back from within. Their consciousness had not been fully absorbed, and they were causing disruptions in the collective network. Alan Torres and thousands of other partially infected humans were waging a secret war inside their own minds. Torres could feel the parasite trying to crush his identity and absorb him completely. He fought back with memories of his family and his friends and his love for humanity. Around him in the collective network, other humans were doing the same thing. They could communicate with each other through the parasite connection, and together they planned their rebellion. When Pierce's fleet attacked, they acted. All at once, thousands of infected humans stopped following orders and started sabotaging the parasite's defense systems. It was not much, but it created confusion, and that confusion gave Pierce the opening he needed. The Admiral ordered all remaining ships to focus fire on one section of the Nexus, creating a corridor through the defensive weapons. His flagship would go through that corridor and ram the Nexus at full speed. The other ships would cover him for as long as they could. Pierce's crew knew what he was planning, and not one of them objected. They had volunteered for a suicide mission, and now it was time to complete it. The captain of the ship asked Pierce if he wanted to say any last words, and the Admiral shook his head. Words were not going to save humanity. Only action would. Monroe saw the telemetry from Pierce's fleet and knew what he was about to do. She activated the global broadcast system ahead of schedule, hoping it would help somehow. Across Earth, every satellite and tower began transmitting the anti-parasite frequency. Infected people around the world collapsed as the parasites in their brains went dormant. The collective consciousness screamed in pain as billions of connections were severed at once. The Nexus in deep space shuddered, and its defenses faltered for just a moment. Pierce saw his chance and took it. The flagship accelerated to maximum speed, with alarms blaring and systems failing all around. Pierce gripped the command chair as the ship shook itself apart from the stress. They shot through the corridor his fleet had created, and organic weapons tore pieces off the hull. The crew held on as bulkheads collapsed and fires broke out. They were less than a mile from the Nexus when the main engines exploded. The ship began to tumble, but momentum carried them forward. Pierce looked at his crew one last time and told them it had been an honor. Then they hit the Nexus and the flagship's reactor detonated. The explosion was visible from Earth as a bright star that appeared and then faded in the sky beyond Neptune. The Nexus was destroyed, and with it, the central intelligence that controlled the Parasite Collective. On Earth and on every Velthran-controlled world across the galaxy, the parasites lost their coordination. The infected host collapsed as the commanding consciousness that held them together shattered into fragments. Monroe watched her screens as the readings from the Nexus went to 0. Pierce and his entire fleet were gone, but they had won. Humanity was free. Rita Chen secured the Colorado facility and stood among the unconscious infected soldiers. They would wake up soon, and they would be themselves again. She thought about Captain Harper, and hoped that whatever was left of him could find peace. Around the world, resistance teams were reporting success. The broadcast was working, and infected people were recovering. Kevin White collapsed at his console and slept for the first time in days. He dreamed of Dr. Wells and Alan Torres and all the people who gave their lives so that humanity could survive. The Velthran hosts, who had been controlled by the parasites for centuries, began to wake up. They were individuals again from dozens of different species. Most of them could not cope with the memories of what they had done while infected. They had helped consume entire civilizations, and the guilt destroyed them. Some took their own lives. Others shared what they knew about the parasites and warned humanity about other threats in the galaxy. The beautiful crystalline beings that had greeted Captain Harper on that first day were revealed to be the remnants of a species called the Krell, who had been consumed 3,000 years ago. Monroe stood in the Antarctic facility and watched the sun rise over the ice. Earth was safe, but the cost had been terrible. More than 1 billion people had been infected, and while most of them recovered, they would carry the psychological scars forever. Admiral Pierce and 3,000 resistance fighters were dead. Dr. Wells and the crew of the Horizon were gone. The list of casualties went on and on. But humanity had survived, and that was what mattered. Monroe made a promise to herself that Earth would never be caught unprepared again. She would build a defense force that could protect humanity from any threat the galaxy could throw at them. The president gave a speech calling Monroe a hero, but she did not feel like one. She felt tired and sad and angry that so many had to die. The cleanup took months, and the work was harder than anyone expected. Lisa Monroe was promoted to admiral and given command of the newly formed Space Defense Initiative. Her first task was organizing medical teams to treat the 1 billion people who had been infected by the parasites. Most of them recovered physically, but their minds were damaged in ways that doctors were still trying to understand. They had memories of being part of something larger than themselves, a collective consciousness where individual thoughts merged into a single overwhelming presence. Some people said it felt like drowning, while others described it as being trapped in a nightmare they could not wake from. Dr. Henry Brooks became the leading expert on parasite removal and treatment. He worked with researchers from around the world developing procedures to safely extract dormant parasites from infected patients. The process was delicate because the organisms had integrated themselves into neural tissue. If removed incorrectly, they could cause permanent brain damage or death. Brooks and his teams worked 18-hour days treating thousands of patients. The success rate improved with each procedure, but there were still failures. Some people could not be saved, and Brooks carried the weight of every loss. Rita Chen took over as head of Earth's military security. She knew that the Velthran invasion had exposed how unprepared humanity was for threats from space. Chen began training new soldiers and developing tactics for fighting enemies that did not play by human rules. She also worked with engineers to design weapons that could counter biological and parasitic attacks. Her experiences fighting infected humans had taught her that sometimes the greatest threats looked exactly like friends and neighbors. She was determined that humanity would never be caught off guard again. Kevin White became a senior analyst for the intelligence division. His job was monitoring communications across the solar system, looking for any signs that the parasites might return. He also tracked down former Velthran hosts who had information about other dangers in the galaxy. White interviewed hundreds of freed aliens, learning about species that had been consumed by the parasites over thousands of years. Each story was tragic, but they all had one thing in common. The victims had welcomed The Velthran with open arms believing they were friends, and by the time they realized the truth, it was too late. Monroe ordered the construction of 20 new warships designed specifically for deep space combat. These were not exploration vessels like the Horizon. They were weapons built to protect Earth from anything the galaxy could throw at them. The ships had armor thick enough to survive organic weapons, and they carried enough firepower to destroy targets the size of small moons. Monroe personally oversaw every aspect of their design, making sure that humanity would never again have to send old cargo haulers into battle. The first ship was named the Pierce in honor of the admiral who had given his life to save humanity. 5 months after the invasion ended, Monroe received a disturbing report. A survey team exploring the wreckage of the Horizon had found something unexpected. Deep inside the destroyed ship was a data core that had survived the explosion. The core contained all of Dr. Karen Wells's research, including her final message recorded moments before the ship was destroyed. Monroe had the core brought to Earth and assembled a team to extract the information. What they found made her realize the war was not really over. Wells' final message was clear and terrifying. The parasites they had fought were only one strain of an ancient threat. The doctor had discovered references in the Velthran biological data to other parasite species with different methods of infection and control. Some attacked through water supplies while others could spread through electronic systems. Wells warned that the parasite nexus they destroyed was just one of many scattered across the galaxy. Destroying it had saved Earth, but other species were still fighting for survival against similar threats. The message ended with Wells saying that humanity had to warn others and help them before it was too late. Monroe called an emergency meeting with Chen, White, and the president. They sat in a secure room deep under the new Space Defense headquarters and watched Wells' message 3 times. The implications were staggering. If other parasite strains existed, then Earth could face another invasion at any time. President Cross wanted to focus on rebuilding and strengthening Earth's defenses, but Monroe argued they had a responsibility to help other species. Humanity had survived because of Torres and the other infected humans who fought back from within. Now they owed it to the galaxy to share what they had learned. The decision was made to send out warning beacons to every system within 100 light years. The beacons contained information about the parasites and how to fight them. They also offered Earth's help to any species facing invasion. White designed the beacons to be simple enough that any civilization with basic technology could understand them. Within weeks, the beacons were launched and humanity waited to see if anyone would respond. The first reply came from a species called the Dorvani, who lived 40 light years away. They said they were being attacked by something that sounded exactly like the parasites and they desperately needed help. Monroe assembled a task force of 5 warships and led them personally to Dorvani space. The journey took 3 weeks at maximum speed, and when they arrived, the situation was worse than anyone feared. The Dorvani homeworld was under full invasion with more than half the population infected. The parasites here were slightly different from the Velthran strain. They spread faster but were less resistant to electromagnetic frequencies. Monroe's ships entered orbit and began broadcasting the anti-parasite frequency across the planet. Millions of Dorvani collapsed, but when they woke up, they were free. The Dorvani leader was a female named Keeper Salna, who looked like a cross between a bear and a lizard. She thanked Monroe with tears in her large golden eyes and said that humanity had saved her species from extinction. Salna shared information about other worlds that had been attacked by parasites. She said there were rumors of entire sectors of space that had gone silent, and that traders avoided certain regions because ships that went there never returned. Monroe realized the parasite threat was far larger than she had imagined. Over the next year, Monroe's task force responded to 7 more invasion attempts across 4 different systems. Each time they arrived to find species fighting desperately against parasitic enemies. Each time, humanity's weapons and knowledge turned the tide of battle. Word spread across the galaxy that humans were fighting the parasites and winning. Species that had been isolated and afraid began reaching out to Earth asking for help and offering alliances. Humanity went from being unknown newcomers to respected warriors in less than 2 years. But success came with a price. Monroe lost ships and crews in battles against heavily infected worlds. Rita Chen led ground missions that resulted in casualties and injuries. Kevin White worked himself to exhaustion analyzing parasite communication patterns, trying to predict where they would strike next. The people of Earth were tired of war, and many questioned why they should risk human lives to save aliens they had never met. The president faced growing opposition from those who wanted Earth to focus on its own problems and let the rest of the galaxy take care of itself. Monroe stood before the United Earth Coalition Council and defended her actions. She said that humanity had learned something important during their own invasion. The galaxy was full of threats, but it was also full of potential allies. Every species they saved was a friend who would stand with them when the next crisis came. She reminded the council that Alan Torres and thousands of other infected humans had helped destroy the Nexus by fighting from within. If humanity abandoned other species now, then they were no better than the parasites who consumed civilizations without mercy. The council voted to continue the defense missions, but with limited resources. Monroe could keep her task force, but she would not get reinforcements or additional ships. It was a political compromise that satisfied no one, but it was better than nothing. Chen told Monroe privately that they were being set up to fail. If the mission succeeded, the politicians would take credit, but if they failed, Monroe would be blamed. Monroe said she did not care about politics. She cared about doing what was right and saving lives. Chen smiled and said that was why she followed Monroe into every dangerous situation without hesitation. Kevin White made a discovery that changed everything. By analyzing the data from multiple parasite strains, he found a pattern. All the parasites seemed to originate from a single region of space known as the Dark Zone. It was an area beyond the galactic core where no stars shone and sensors could not penetrate. Traders called it cursed, and no one went there by choice. White believed that somewhere in the Dark Zone was the source of all the parasite strains, a mother nest or breeding ground where they were created. If they could find and destroy it, then the parasite threat might end forever. Monroe looked at the star charts showing the Dark Zone and felt a chill run down her spine. The region was thousands of light years away and completely unmapped. Getting there would take months, and they had no idea what they would find. But if White was right, then they had to try. She began planning an expedition that would take humanity farther from Earth. Admiral Lisa. Monroe stood in the hangar bay watching workers load supplies onto the 6 ships that would make the journey to the Dark Zone. She had chosen each vessel, carefully balancing firepower with speed and endurance. The flagship was the Pierce, the most advanced warship humanity had ever built. Beside it sat 5 other ships, including 2 carriers that held fighter squadrons and 3 heavy cruisers bristling with weapons. The crews totaled 800 people, and every single one of them had volunteered, knowing they might not return. Rita Chen walked up beside Monroe carrying a datapad with the final crew roster. She had personally interviewed every volunteer, making sure they understood the risks. Chen herself would be going as head of security and ground forces. Kevin White would serve as chief analyst responsible for tracking parasite signals and finding the source. Dr. Henry Brooks had also volunteered to come as chief medical officer. Monroe had tried to talk him out of it, saying Earth needed him more, but Brooks insisted. He said if they found the parasite source, there would likely be infected victims who needed treatment, and he was not going to let someone else take that burden. The departure ceremony was small and quiet. President Cross gave a short speech thanking the volunteers for their courage, but Monroe could see the worry in her eyes. The president knew this mission was a long shot, and losing 800 people, including Earth's best admiral, would be devastating. Monroe saluted and boarded the Pierce with her senior staff. The ships lifted off and climbed through Earth's atmosphere into the darkness of space. Behind them, the planet looked small and fragile, and Monroe wondered if she would ever see it again. The journey to the Dark Zone took 4 months at maximum sustainable speed. The ships traveled through regions of space that had never been mapped by humans. They passed alien worlds that were silent and dead, victims of parasites or other threats. Kevin White monitored communications, constantly looking for any signals that might help them. 3 weeks into the journey, they picked up a distress call from a cargo ship under attack. Monroe diverted to help and found the ship being boarded by infected aliens from a species she had never seen before. Her fighters drove off the attackers and rescued the cargo crew, who were grateful but confused about why humans had come so far from their territory. Rita Chen interrogated the infected aliens after Brooks treated them with the anti-parasite frequency. They remembered being part of the collective, and they described a presence that felt ancient and impossibly vast. The parasites did not just control their hosts. They absorbed memories and knowledge from every species they consumed. Chen realized that the collective intelligence they fought was actually made up of pieces from thousands of dead civilizations. It was a horrible thought that the very thing destroying species was also the only record that they had ever existed. As they got closer to the dark zone, the ships began experiencing strange sensor readings. Space itself seemed wrong here, with gravitational fluctuations that made navigation difficult. Stars that should have been visible were blocked by clouds of dark matter that absorbed all light. White said they were entering a region that defied normal physics and that the laws of nature might work differently here. Monroe ordered everyone to yellow alert and reduce their speed. Whatever was waiting in the dark zone, she wanted to be ready for it. The source revealed itself on the 5th month of the journey. The ships emerged from a dark matter cloud and found themselves facing a structure that made the parasite nexus look tiny. It was a living planet, an organic sphere the size of Earth covered in pulsing tissue and writhing tentacles. Energy readings showed it was producing millions of parasite organisms every day and launching them into space in organic pods that would drift until they found new worlds to infect. White's voice shook as he reported that the structure was not just a breeding ground. It was alive and intelligent, and it had been here for millions of years, seeding the galaxy with parasites. Monroe ordered the fleet to attack formation, but before they could fire, the living planet spoke. Its voice came through every communication system simultaneously, and it was made up of thousands of different voices from species long dead. The entity said it had been watching humanity since they destroyed the Velthran Nexus. It called humans interesting and said their resistance was unexpected. Most species surrendered or were consumed quickly, but humans fought back with a ferocity that impressed it. The entity offered humanity a choice: join the collective willingly and keep their individuality as administrators helping to manage other infected species, or die fighting a battle they could not win. Monroe felt rage building in her chest. This thing had consumed countless civilizations and destroyed billions of lives, and now it had the audacity to call that impressive. She opened a channel and told the entity that humanity would never join anything that took away freedom and choice. She said that humans had a saying about situations like this, and the entity asked what it was. Monroe smiled grimly and said the phrase was humanity fuck yeah, and then she gave the order to fire everything they had. The battle that followed was unlike anything the human fleet had experienced. The living planet defended itself with organic weapons that grew from its surface and fired living projectiles that could think and adapt. Monroe's ships dodged and weaved through clouds of attacking organisms, while their weapons carved chunks out of the planet's surface. The Pierce took heavy damage when a mass of tentacles wrapped around it and started crushing the hull. Chen led boarding teams to cut through the organic matter with plasma torches, while Brooks treated crew members who were exposed to parasite spores. Kevin White found a weakness in the entity's defenses. The living planet needed massive amounts of energy to sustain itself and produce parasites. That energy came from a core deep inside the structure that functioned like a biological fusion reactor. If they could reach the core and destabilize it, the entire planet would tear itself apart. Monroe ordered 2 of the heavy cruisers to create an opening, while the Pierce would dive through and deliver a payload directly to the core. It was suicide, but it was also their only chance. The 2 cruisers hammered the planet's surface with everything they had, creating a canyon that went miles deep. The Pierce accelerated to maximum speed and dove into the opening with organic weapons tearing at its hull. The ship shook and alarms blared as systems failed one after another. Monroe held her course even as the bridge started to depressurize. Chen and her security teams fought off boarding parasites that had gotten inside the ship. Brooks worked frantically to keep injured crew members alive while the ship came apart around them. They reached the core, and Monroe launched every missile and bomb the Pierce carried. The weapons penetrated deep into the organic reactor and then detonated simultaneously. The living planet screamed in 1,000 voices as its core destabilized. Massive explosions rippled across its surface and tentacles thrashed wildly. Monroe ordered all ships to retreat at maximum speed as the planet began collapsing in on itself. The Pierce barely made it clear before the entire structure imploded, creating a shockwave that damaged 2 of the escort ships. The entity's final words came through the communication systems as it died. It said that humans were dangerous and that the galaxy would learn to fear them. Monroe did not care what the galaxy thought. She cared that the parasite threat was finally ended. The fleet limped back toward Earth with heavy damage and significant casualties. They had lost 1 carrier and 1 cruiser, along with 200 crew members. But they had succeeded in destroying the source of the parasites and saving countless future civilizations from infection. The journey home took 6 months because of the damage the ships had sustained. Monroe used that time to write reports and recommendations for Earth's defense. She said that humanity needed to stay vigilant because the galaxy was full of threats they did not understand yet. The parasite entity had called humans dangerous, and Monroe thought that was good. Let the hostile species out there know that humanity would fight back and that attacking Earth would cost them everything. When the fleet finally reached Earth orbit, they were greeted as heroes. The president organized a massive celebration, and millions of people gathered to welcome them home. Monroe stood on the bridge of the damaged piers looking down at the blue planet below and felt overwhelming relief. They had saved humanity and proven that humans could face impossible odds and still win. Chen stood beside her and said that Admiral Pierce would have been proud. Monroe nodded and said that every person who died fighting the parasites had contributed to this victory. They were all heroes. Rita Chen retired from military service and became a teacher training the next generation of soldiers. She told her students about the importance of never giving up and always protecting those who could not protect themselves. Kevin White continued working in intelligence and developed early warning systems that would detect any future parasite activity. Dr. Henry Brooks opened a research center focused on xenobiology and understanding alien threats before they could harm humanity. Monroe remained as head of the Space Defense Initiative, building a fleet that would protect Earth and its allies. The human warships became a common sight across the galaxy as they responded to distress calls and